50, 60% of papers are rejected after editorial review. The remaining are sent out for external review. And once it goes for external review, it could go in one of two ways. It could be, hey, this is a paper of interest to us, and we want to invite a revision, or this is not a paper of interest to us, and we will reject it.
Welcome back to Published MD, the channel where we help clinical researchers navigate the publishing world. In this episode, we'll be diving deep into some of the most common hurdles researchers face when publishing their work. And so we have a very, very special guest today. I'm thrilled to welcome a true expert in academic publishing, Dr. Rajnish Mehrotra. Dr. Mehrotra is the Belding Scribner Endowed Chair, Professor of Medicine, and Head of the Division of Nephrology. And he has a career dedicated to improving the lives of people with advanced kidney disease. What's special about him, particularly for this episode, is that he's also the Senior Editor-in-Chief of the American Society of Nephrology Journal Portfolio, which is multiple research papers, and the President of the International Society of Peritoneal Dialysis. And today, Dr. Mehrotra will be sharing insights on common mistakes in submissions, why papers get rejected, how to choose the right journal, and many, many more. So if you're serious about taking your research from manuscript to publication, you won't want to miss this one. Welcome, Dr. Mehrotra.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for making the time and allowing me to reach to your listeners.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So let's get started. I think one of the most common questions I get from the audience is, how do you actually choose the right journal for your research? Like, there's open access, there's behind a paywall, there's so many impact factor. Like, how do you choose the right journal?
I think what is important to know is what is the message that your paper is communicating and what is the audience for any given journal. So if, for example, we are in nephrology, if the findings from the work that you have broadly apply to people with kidney diseases, whether it is work that is done in the bench or in the clinical world, including clinical trials, it would be best for you to publish it in a journal that the audience for which is kidney professionals. Alternatively, if you think that there's a broader impact of the work that you have, for example, basic science work that may broadly influence our understanding of cell biology, for example, mechanisms of disease that extend beyond the kidney, or there are major advances in the field of kidney disease research, a general medical journal, whether it's a general science journal like Cell or Nature or JCI, or a clinical journal such as the New England Journal of Medicine, would be the right audience. Of course, I am the editor-in-chief for the ASN portfolio of journals, and I would like to see the best kidney-related science in the ASN portfolio. But I also celebrate when kidney disease research is published in general medical journals, because it communicates to the world at large the innovations and the excitement of the field and attracts more people to the field that may not have considered otherwise, whether it's trainees or researchers, postdocs, pre-docs. So nevertheless, to summarize, it's what your message is from the paper and who you believe the audience for the journal is, that makes for the right pitch.
Right. So choosing the right audience. And one more thing I want to ask, because sometimes audience is one. Another thing I think about is also the caliber of the paper. How do you know if your paper, it may suit the audience, but is it of a high caliber? Is it a good enough caliber? How do you adjust the caliber to the journal?
I think, in the way I've been a journal editor now, this is my 8th year of doing it. And the way I think about a paper that comes through the door, if you were, is first to determine, is this research valid? And when I say valid, as in, for example, for clinical research, are these findings internally valid? And are they externally valid? Are they applicable to the broad population of people with kidney diseases, for example? And if they're valid, if true, is that collectively a meaningful advance in the field? Is this new knowledge that is over and above what we know before this paper would have been published? As an aside, this does not mean that you do not publish things that are confirmatory, because, for example, one clinical trial is never enough for you to determine the efficacy of a drug or an intervention. You need at least two trials to say that. So confirmatory studies are important as well. I want to put that on the side, but I think it's the validity of the findings as well as what that meaningful advance is. The second part, which is whether or not it's a meaningful advance, is inherently subjective. It is to make, and it is, and then I would go further in terms of, use the word caliber of research. I would rephrase it by saying, what is the magnitude with which it increases our knowledge? So if it is a large gain in knowledge, a more prestigious journal would be interested in that work. If it is a small increase in knowledge, then maybe you may be shooting too high to be targeting a more prestigious journal. In the end, it is inherently subjective, and I would be the first to acknowledge that journals and authors make mistakes. And people will give you examples of times when the most cited paper in medicine was rejected by 5 journals before it got published. And so people make mistakes and will make mistakes, but in summary, it is an assessment of what that magnitude of advance is in the work.
I'm glad you brought this up, because when I was talking about caliber, all I was thinking how good the quality is, the rigor of the study, the sample size, the biggest. So I'm thinking about in that objective data, but really what makes it to a top journal is actually how much it can move things forward, how it can change the practice. And that's what we need to think about, like the so what. Just because it's the biggest paper.
Exactly. Yeah. So, pardon, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think, that's very important. This is thing that it allows, like, you need to take a step back when you look at a paper. A well-designed and executed work is a prerequisite. It's not sufficient.
Right.
And the example I give often, like homocysteine, like, who cares? Homocysteine, been there, done that. We know that we cannot, it's a marker and not a causative mechanism. And maybe there'll be somebody who'll be offended by my example of homocysteine. But there are things such as that where it could be the best science ever done, but it's so what? It's so what? And that is, and I would say that hot needs to be there when you start doing the work. And not, of course, not just when you're writing about that work in a paper. Like when you're requesting grant funding, when you're designing your study, that's the bigger advice that I have, is tackle the most important questions there are in science, because that's the one that is where the greatest need is and where you have the greatest probability of advancing the field meaningfully.
Right. Make sure when you're designing, ask the right questions, find the questions that need solving, or what's the problem. Right. If not, you can collect a lot of data and write the paper. One mistake I often see, like what you've mentioned, is that they think writing it well is going to fix things. Writing it well is not going to fix question. Writing it well is not going to solve the problem. So thank you so much for that.
I mean, I would also say that, maybe we'll get to that further along the way, is that it is also common for authors to be speaking to people that are working in the field. When I say in the way they write the paper, in the acronyms they use, they're talking to people that are working in that narrow area where they are working. And when I evaluate the work, it is important for me to be convinced that we can communicate this to the wider audience. So for example, like, you can take example, somebody that is working in a molecular pathway, for example, in glomerular diseases. Yes, of course, the most interest would be from people that are working in that field, but it needs to be understood by a broader population of readers for a journal such as JASN or any of the ASN journal portfolios, and that applies to other journals as well. It needs to make sense to a broader audience. And that needs to be kept in mind when authors are writing their papers as well.
I can't agree more. So when I first start, I tend to write, people are going to understand the mechanism. People are going to understand this abbreviation, not realizing the goal is actually to move science in a broader field. And also peer reviewers may not always be that narrow focus of person reviewing the paper. So making sure you are walking it through step by step so that people can follow your thought process is really important.
Just talking about acronyms, that's the one that I'm particular about. It's over, like I can give you a couple examples, like people who use the word PD. In my world, it's peritoneal dialysis.
Mm-hmm.
In the world of people in education, it's program director.
Oh, right.
In basic science world, there's this acronym PTC, and I've seen it being used for proximal tubular cells and peritubular capillaries. So really,
They all mean different things.
there is no reason for you to use acronyms. I really think it needs to be easily read. It needs to be smooth reading of the English language in the way a paper should be written. And when people use acronyms, and the same acronym can mean different things in different worlds, it is when you're trying to speak to a very narrow audience. Try speaking to a larger audience.
Right. I like that mindset. When I write, let me see how I can write this in a way that the broad people can understand. I know conducting a research project is an overwhelming process, so I made the idea to paper blueprint for you. This blueprint takes you through a 7-step process from the idea generation phase to the paper submission phase. Plus, you'll get my free 5-day email course, Jumpstart Your Academic Writing. We will cover mindset, key writing tips, how do you beat writer's block, and more. So click on the link in the description below. Speaking of peer review, maybe can you talk about the peer review process in general, or maybe specific to the ASN journal portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this as a 2-step process. The first step is editorial review, which is done by at least 2 members of the editorial team, usually an editor-in-chief and a deputy editor. Sometimes it also includes 3 people. It is an associate editor. And the key assessment that is being made at that time is this, from a very high level, is this a meaningful advance in what it describes, and some very broad parameters about a fit, whether or not, for example, say a case report is not something we publish in JSON as an example. That's an extreme example. But broadly, what ends up happening is that if in the assessment of the editorial team, it is not a meaningful advance, or, for example, it could be a very small study asking a very important question that is not adequately powered, for example, is something that we would reject. People use the word triage, people use the word test reject, whatever else you may say. It is important for people to know that their paper was read. It was not sent out for external review, but it was reviewed by at least 2 people. The standard that I've always maintained, that if both agree, it'll be sent out. If both agree, it could be rejected. But if at least one of them thinks it should go out, the other does not think it should go out, no matter who that person is, it'll go out for external review. For example, the deputy editor thinks it should go out, and I think, oh my God, this is not so good. Even though I'm the editor-in-chief, the deputy editor would be important. Their opinion would be important in sending it out for external review. Once it goes for external review, our goal generally is to get 3 external reviewers. I can tell you that review work is volunteer work. And as there has been increasing number of journals, the same people are being asked to do a lot of reviews. That is a long way of saying the most challenging part of peer review is lining up good reviewers. Sometimes it can take a week or 10 days to even get 3 people to accept to review the paper. And sometimes you don't even get 3 reviews back. Even when people agree, people are otherwise busy and they may not be able to complete the review. And so sometimes we have only 2 reviews completed. But be as it may, so maybe about 50-60% of papers are rejected at JSON after editorial review. The remaining are sent out for external review. And once it goes for external review, it could go in one of 2 ways. It could be, hey, this is a paper of interest to us, and we want to invite a revision, or this is not a paper of interest to us, and we will reject it. What we try to do is to, for papers where we have at least some interest, we discuss them on a weekly phone call with the entire editorial team. I think that weekly phone call is very important because that ensures that the associate editors are not working in silos. we have a team of 15 associate editors, 3 deputy editors, and then we have 17 editorial fellows. And so all of them join in and weigh in on a paper. But it is not simply that they're weighing in on a paper. Even if you don't speak up, you are listening to how a paper in glomerular disease is being handled. What is that bar? It's a subjective assessment again. What is that bar for science that we want to consider? An example would be, for example, if you have some predictive modeling that somebody does that may be of interest, our expectation is that it is not simply good enough for you to have a cohort where you develop that work. There needs to be validation in an independent cohort. I'm articulating a principle so that, for example, the same principle applies for glomerular disease as may apply for AKI, as may apply for dialysis. For us to have this collective understanding, we gain that from when we convene once a week on a phone call. I gave you the most easiest examples, but you can, what is the expectation of animal models in which an experiment may be done, for example? What degree of mechanistic insight do we need for a basic science paper to move forward? There are these overarching issues that extend across thematic areas for everybody to be listening in and allows us to be consistent. The 3 guiding principles that I have in all works that I do as a leader is consistency, transparency, and equity. And I'm the first to acknowledge that we fail sometimes. We are trying our best. We are humans. We make mistakes. Yet we try to create structures that allow us to be consistent, transparent, and equitable.
I love this. So it was so much to unpack here. I'm going to do a few quick takeaways. So the first thing I kind of noticed was you said the rejection was about 50 to 60%, even just the desk rejection. So this is a key message for the audience out there, is that if your paper gets rejected, it's not a failure on your part. It's very common. So it's like more than 50, like 60%. That means the chance of getting rejected is higher than getting accepted. So that's the first key takeaway. And that second key takeaway is that to get peer reviews are really difficult. It may take them weeks and weeks. And then by the time we get that 2 or 3 people, they take another few weeks. So that's why the whole cycle for publication takes that long. I think the bottleneck is finding peer reviewer. Even finding that person may take weeks. So be patient when you are submitting paper, and you have to take that into consideration when you are planning your research grants and your scholarly productivity. Not wait and sit on it, because it takes time to go from submission to peer review to rejection, or maybe just multiple rounds of review. So that's my second takeaway. And then third takeaway is that because everything's so subjective, all of us have slightly different standards. Having a group like what the American Society of Nephrology Journal portfolio is doing is that in order to raise the bar or make sure everybody is having similar standards, having weekly meetings to go through so that we all reset our standard and know the bar for each different type of paper. So I think these are really, really great takeaways from what the last few minutes of conversation.
Thank you for unpacking it and clearly summarizing that. Just a few follow-up things collectively as we think about this as a scientific research community. Every time my paper is rejected, it's a gut punch, right? You just feel like I put my heart and soul into this, and they didn't even send it out for external review. There are 2 reasons why I think in the system we have, we still persist with it in terms of what we call desk reject. The first is what I said previously. We are asking a lot of time from reviewers. So if there's not sufficient editorial enthusiasm for an area of work because we don't believe it is significant, it is just delaying your work from finding a home. And then we are also limiting the time that we are at, like peer reviewers are difficult to find anyway. If we double the number of papers we send out for external review, we are doubling our ask of peer reviewers. And you pointed out that ASN has a portfolio of journals, and what we have worked very hard for these last 6 months. Previously, each of the three journals functioned independently with independent submission requirements. We've streamlined it all. And the reason I say that in this context is that even if, for example, a paper doesn't make its way at JSON, for example, if it's a clinical paper, it could be cascaded to CJSON quickly without additional input from the authors. It is work done at the back end or to Kidney 360. And that's true for other portfolio of journals as well. Yeah, so to kind of wrap it up, yes, it feels terrible when my paper is rejected, when my grant is not discussed, when my grant is not funded. Hopefully, it actually speeds up the process of finding a home for the work in a journal where it may be a better fit.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought this up because sometimes it's easy to say from a junior faculty, yeah, my paper gets rejected and I feel sad about it. But hearing from you, the editor-in-chief, saying, I still feel gut punched when I get a rejection, it normalizes how it actually feels. And this is the reality. And also the second part is when you get rejected, you can move on faster, right? Instead of letting it sit there for months and months.
And, I'm a clinical researcher, you're a clinical researcher, people in the lab, the amount of work experiments that is necessary, sometimes the careers of a PhD candidate depend upon getting XYZ number of papers published. And if a journal dangles them and eventually rejects that paper, the impact on careers of individuals is very large because that is preventing people from moving, or somebody that is putting up their portfolio to submit a career development grant, for example. So, you want to make sure those papers are moving fast enough to find a home for people to build that portfolio that makes them competitive to get a PhD, to get a career development grant. And so that's important too.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you earlier mentioned that when you look at papers, you are asking about, which one has the most impact? In your mind, what makes a paper stand out?
Yeah, it is what I said previously. It is the magnitude of advance that a paper is making. One of the things that I learned very early on is for me not to try to project which paper is going to be cited a lot. We are not good at that. And the first thing is that is not the goal of our, yes, we value citations, we value impact factor, but in the end, that's not the primary reason why we have scientific publishing. For example, if there is this beautiful area of work that is advancing a very rare disease where very few people are working, but in the end, it unravels the pathogenesis of that rare disease, that paper will not be cited because it's a rare disease and there are not many people working in that area. Yet, the fact that we finally understand the pathobiology of a rare disease, like we published recently a paper on glycogen storage disease. I couldn't even tell you which type of glycogen storage disease it was. But I don't know how many people are living with that disease, yet we felt that paper was very important for us to publish because it advanced the field meaningfully. So A, we cannot predict which papers will be cited. B, we have a responsibility to publish science that advances our understanding of rare diseases where not much work is happening, as much as, you can publish any paper on SGLT2 inhibitors and you'll get a bunch of citations and social media interest. I think they're both important.
For audience who don't know what SGLT2 is, it's a breakthrough diabetes medication that has been effective not just for sugar control, but also for kidney protection. It's also heart protection. So it's one of those drugs that as soon as you publish it, you will get a lot of citations. Right. Now that, let's say you have your paper, you went through peer review, okay? And then now the next thing that happens, you get the reviewer feedback. A common question is like, how do you respond to feedback? Or how do you not just respond physically in writing, but emotionally? What's the right way to respond to reviewer?
Well, at least I speak for the ASN portfolio of journals, and I think that's true for most journals, is that you're pitching your arguments and response to the editors and not the reviewers. And this is not to say that the reviewer's input is not important. Reviewer's input is critical. But what an editor is trying to balance potentially is competing asks potentially, say, from reviewers. One may say do this, one may say do that. In the end, somebody needs to kind of put it all together. And that's the editor. And so the person you are pitching your response to is the editor. I would also say it's all right. For example, if there is any aspect of the review where it is unclear to you as an author what the expectation is, or there is more than one way of dealing with it, it's all right to reach out to the editorial team for guidance while you're preparing your response. You can write to me or write to Connie at CJason or another editor for you to reach out for guidance. Like, would this meet the expectation to be able to do that? I don't think people do it often enough. People feel that there is a barrier. And I would actually go one step further. You asked me, how do you decide which journal is the best fit for the work? It's all right for you to reach out to the editor of a journal up front and say, hey, this is the abstract. This is what I'm working on. Is this a good fit? And that's all right too. Not enough people do that. And I encourage people to reach out to me all the time, whether prior to submission or when they're revising their paper. And finally, the production schedule is like being on a treadmill. It's moving. And we say, oh, get your paper back in 6 weeks. But maybe you have this new data that you need to generate and you cannot be done in 6 weeks and you need an extension. We're happy to provide that extension to people. I just want to be able to communicate that there is not that wall between the editorial team and authors, as authors sometimes thinks there is.
So I always had that feeling like, oh, I can't talk to the editor board because I thought everything needs to go through that little platform, that editorial manager site. It's only a one-way street. But it was soon later, after a few years, I realized that, oh, actually, I can ask for something. Can I request, oh, do I really need to do this? Because that will increase our data collection for another 6 months. We won't be able to do that. Is that really necessary? So even asking that question is okay. I would say this is particularly important for basic science researchers. Clinical researchers, a lot of times we do electronic health records. We just request for more data, no problem. But when it gets to basic science, it could be a matter of, oh, now I need to breed more mice, and that's going to take another 6 months. And as a junior faculty, you may not think that I can push back a little bit and find out if that's truly necessary, because they may not know that this extra thing you're asking for could take a lot of time. And like the peer reviewer, I'm glad you mentioned that too, is that sometimes we as peer reviewers, we say things as a suggestion, like it's nice to have, but doesn't mean that it's a must have. So if you're not sure, reaching out to the editorial board to find out, is it a must have or is it nice to have, and explaining what issues you may face is going to be really important. Yeah. A lot of us seem to think that there's a barrier between the researchers and the editorial board. What are the other common myths about publishing in academic journal that you have seen?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just in academic publishing, it's in academics generally, that it is, euphemistically speaking, like an old boys club. It's no longer an old boys club, it's an old boy and old gals club. That there are these core group of investigators that they can get their work published anywhere. And then we are the struggling majority that we cannot get our work published. I can tell you for the most part, when I look at a paper, I don't look at the list of the authors. It is not blinded. There are journals that would blind the names of the authors. We don't do that. I think it is what I encourage my team to do as well, is that they're simply because nobody gets a pass. We should not assume they have XYZ or they've done XYZ and that they will be able to do that. You judge the paper as is presented to you. And so don't give anyone the benefit of the doubt when evaluating a paper. And that hopefully levels the playing field for authors, for early career investigators, as well as late career investigators collectively. that the bar of internal and external validity, reproducibility of research, what you may, and the magnitude of advance over our existing knowledge is important no matter what. So I would just say that as the first thing, that we try to be author agnostic.
Mhm.
Do I believe that all the associate editors on our team are author agnostic? I don't know. I hope they are, because that's the consistent message they hear from me. The second thing is, I think it is also common for grant submissions. People think who their friends are who will give a favorable review versus those that will be harsh in reviewing their work.
Yes.
People have actually evaluated that scientifically in like preferred reviewers, non-preferred reviewers who gave a favorable recommendation. There is no relationship. So you actually don't know your friends or your enemies, and I would actually rephrase it. I think virtually everybody working in scientific publishing strives to be objective and does not bring in personal grievances or assessments. People may have opinions about a certain area of science or an area of research and may have very strongly held views in that regard. Yet, authors are not good in predicting who they are. I still remember this paper we published when I was at CJASN. We got 6 reviewers for that paper. It is a controversial area in nephrology, and I'll leave it at that. And 3 reviewers were adamant this is the worst science ever. This absolutely should be rejected. And 3 said, this is a meaningful advance and you should publish it. And it was 3 and 3, actually split down the middle. And that's where the editorial team had to step in. And I supported it moving forward because strong views, I felt that work needed to be published for the scientific community then to assess the validity and the implications of the findings. So anyway, that's a digression from saying that people think they know who their enemies and friends are, who will give them a good review, who will not give them a good review. It's not, don't think too much about it. It's optional at the ASN portfolio of journals to suggest reviewers. You can, but you don't have to. Those are the 2 things that I would say. And then, I think some of the things we've talked about is mistakes. Some of them make me chuckle. For example, like, somebody will submit a paper to Jason and will address it to the editor-in-chief of Kidney International, or address it to Josie, who's no longer the editor-in-chief of Jason. These are not meaningful mistakes. I don't hold it against them. People are busy. I chuckle when I see that. Like, that's okay. Those things happen. I've made those mistakes myself.
Right. For context, for people who don't realize, researchers tend to move journals to journals. You get rejected and you move to the next one. You kind of transfer the whole thing and you forget to change the name of the cover letter. So these are kind of small mistakes that you can make. It's not a live or die situation, but be a little bit more careful.
One of the things that I sometimes see on social media is that journals are very prescriptive in how a manuscript is formatted. When you're moving from one journal to other, now you have to start over and format it for that journal. At the ASN portfolio of journals, we have no expectations of it being formatted according to our expectations. The only thing that we focus on is the word count. The word count limit for an original research paper is 3,500. We allow up to 4,000 words. Like 6,000 words, we'll ask you to trim it down. But beyond that, in terms of formatting, which page comes first and how you have organized your references, we don't pay attention to that. And that gets back to the point, because if 50, 60% of papers are going to not be sent out for external peer review, why have the author spend so much time in formatting it and for us then to triage it? So just so people know, we have no expectations for it to be formatted at the time of initial submission. If you're interested in the paper and we invite a revision, then we will ask you to reformat it.
Yeah, that's such a great point, because formatting itself takes such a long time, and changing the type of referencing. So it's good to know. Good to know. Going back to how you were saying, being agnostic to the authors. When I first started reviewing paper, because it's a new skill, trying to read a paper objectively, my skill wasn't there yet. Peer reviewers are still human. So sometimes I may subconsciously think, okay, this is from a institution that is stronger. So subconsciously, I may believe that maybe their methods are valid, even though I'm not too sure. How do you try to overcome that for peer reviewers? Because your editorial board, they get training, but the peer reviewers may not get the right amount of training, especially in terms of unconsciously or consciously evaluating papers according to the university or the authors.
I mean, I'll go one step further. The challenge with regards to peer reviewers also is that they're working in isolation. Like we will solicit 3 reviews. The first reviewer doesn't know what the second reviewer. There's no crosstalk between the 2 reviewers, right? There's crosstalk between members of the editorial team. There's no crosstalk between peer reviewers when the review is happening, and so it is very hard for us to influence how a peer reviewer thinks just because there's so many peer reviewers. I think that's the job of the editorial team. Is that what I tell the editorial team is peer reviewers, of course, they're indispensable to our work, but in the end, the editorial team needs to be the referee, and gets back to the weekly call that we have so that we have the same expectation of everyone and don't give anyone a pass. No one gets the benefit of the doubt. The paper should be evaluated in the way it's presented. There is also sometimes an inclination, oh, if they could do this paper would be really great. So we should not think of a paper that we want to be. We should look at the paper that is. Because you have no idea what the limitations the authors have in being able to do X, Y, Z that we think would really make the paper great. We don't know. So judge the paper by what we have is very important.
Okay, great. So peer reviews, they're doing this independently. They will do their best. And then as an editorial board, that's the big responsibility is being the referee and checking and making sure they collect all the best information they can and judge it independently. Okay, now the new issue that is plaguing all the journals this age is AI tools. So now there's AI. Some people use AI to write, to improve the language, which is fine. Some people use AI to do data analysis. What are your thoughts and stance about AI for manuscript writing and data analysis?
Yeah, it is not allowed because in the end, using AI is like plagiarism because it is not something that you wrote. Essentially, what AI does, it takes all the information that is out there and uses it to generate content. And so you cannot claim credit for work that you didn't write. And so that is plagiarism.
To clarify, can I just clarify? Do you mean writing de novo, like fresh writing, or
Yes.
or they've written and then they get AI to like just check on the language and improve the phrasing a little bit? Which one are you talking about?
Okay, which will be okay. But there are concerns that people may write, say, a review article using ChatGPT or whatever else. I don't know if people do that. I actually have no idea. But there's that concern. But in the end, the way we operate also is an honor system, right? So we say what is allowed, what is not allowed. We do allow people to use AI tools. If they use AI tools, they should be in the acknowledgement section of the manuscript. There have been other journals where authors have tried to include ChatGPT as a co-author. ChatGPT is not a co-author. It needs to be a human being. It cannot be a software or a technology. And the extent to which anybody uses AI, we expect them to disclose it. As I said, in the end, it's an honor system. We cannot police that.
Yeah, right. It's how you're going to check. There are software there, but I've tested my own writing myself. I pulled something from 2018, and that time ChatGPT wasn't even available. I was like, oh, let me test which one sounds AI generated. And some paper I wrote in 2018 turned out to be like 70% AI generated. So it is still flawed and not that accurate. So people can't really police that. And honor system is the way at the moment. And that's what science is about. Nobody's going to go back and go to your lab and check all your data. Science is all about being ethical and doing the honorable thing. So thanks for that. One point I want to mention as well is that the reason ChatGPT can't be an author is also because they are not liable. Anybody who puts their name on the paper is liable. If my paper turns out to have false data, the whole group gets retracted. The whole group gets into trouble, but ChatGPT does not get into trouble. So that's one of the main reason why we have to be careful who we put in as author, and when we accept an authorship as well. That's a really important key point to think about. So
Agreed.
one final question. So we've learned so much from the start all the way to the end. What is your one advice for researchers when it comes to publishing research papers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts from when you start thinking of what research to pursue. And that is the most pivotal moment in eventually generating that high impact publication that moves the field meaningfully. That is the most important thing. And then the second thing is do not tie too many emotions to the work. It is, I was the first to acknowledge that once you work that you do, it's a gut punch when it is not accepted. But in the end, it's okay. It's okay. And to move on. So those are the two things that I will say.
Yeah. Submit, reject it, move on. I like that. That's how we're going to end. With that, thank you so much. I want to say thank you so much for Dr. Mehrotra to take his busy time with all his division chief work, chairman work, editor-in-chief work, spend some time to share his knowledge and drop all these golden nuggets to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for making the time to talk to me too.
All right, take care. Have a good day. Now that we've covered the publication process and what journal editors look for, let's talk about one of the most challenging parts of getting published: responding to peer review feedback. In my next video, I'll share practical tips on how to handle critiques, how do you frame your responses, and how to strengthen your paper to maximize your chance of acceptance. So stay tuned, you don't want to miss this.